The morning sky over Seattle was gray, heavy, and silent, like it had already accepted defeat. Inside a nearly empty office tower, once the headquarters of Northbridge Global Holdings, a man sat alone in a glass-walled room that used to represent power. His name was Richard Hale, 58 years old. Once one of the most respected corporate CEOs in the United States. Now, just a man surrounded by silence. The office still carried traces of what it used to be. Framed awards on the walls, half-packed boxes, a broken coffee machine in the corner. But the energy was gone. The company had collapsed 6 months ago. Bad investments, internal betrayal, market crash, lawsuits, everything fell faster than anyone expected. Richard slowly opened a folder in front of him. It contained the final liquidation papers. He didn't read them. He already knew what they said. Assets transferred. Company value, 0. A soft knock came at the door. His assistant, Daniel, stood there holding a small cardboard box. "That's everything from your office, sir." Richard didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he said, "Don't call me sir anymore." Daniel hesitated. Richard stood up slowly, looking around the room one last time. "I spent 30 years building this company," he said quietly, "and it took less than 6 months to erase it." Daniel didn't know what to say. There was nothing anyone could say. Outside the building, reporters were already gone. Investors had disappeared weeks ago. Even friends had stopped calling. That's the reality of corporate life at the top. When you fall alone. Richard walked out carrying only a small black bag. No limousine, no security, no farewell speech. Just a man who used to control thousands of employees, now figuring out how to control his next meal. A few blocks away, life continued normally. People rushed to work. Coffee shops were full. The city didn't care who failed or who succeeded. Richard stopped at a crosswalk, staring at his reflection in a glass building. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. Not the man, not the eyes, not the posture. He looked like someone who had lost not just money but identity. That evening, he moved into a small rented apartment on the edge of the city. One room. Minimal furniture, no luxury, no noise. Just emptiness. He placed the box from his office on the floor. Inside it were old memories. A broken pen from his first deal, a photo with his former board members, and a company nameplate. CEO Richard Hale. He picked it up, looked at it, then placed it face down. That night, Richard couldn't sleep, not because of sadness, but because of something deeper. Fear. Not fear of poverty, fear of irrelevance. The kind of fear that comes when a man realizes the world moves on without him. The next morning, he walked into a small local cafe. No one recognized him, no one cared. He ordered simple coffee. While sitting near the window, he overheard 2 businessmen talking. Northbridge collapsed completely. Yeah, shame. Poor leadership. Richard looked down at his cup. No anger, just silence. Because deep down, he agreed. As he left the cafe, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated. A woman's voice came through. "Is this Richard Hale?" "Yes." There was a pause. "I'm calling regarding a consulting request. From a small startup company looking for someone with your experience." Richard almost laughed. Startup. After everything he lost, someone wanted him to help build again? He replied flatly, "I'm not interested," and he hung up. But as he walked down the street, something strange happened. For the first time in months, a thought appeared in his mind, not about loss, not about failure, but about possibility. Maybe the story wasn't over. Maybe it had just changed direction. The stranger in the small office. The rain had started again over Seattle, soft but steady, like it had become part of the city's personality. Richard Hale stood outside a small building labeled Brightside Consulting. The paint on the sign was slightly faded. The glass door wasn't perfectly clean. The kind of place most former CEOs would never even notice, yet here he was. Inside, the reception area was tiny, 2 chairs, one plant trying its best to survive. A desk with stacks of documents neatly arranged, too neatly for a struggling business. A young woman looked up from her laptop. She was in her early 30s, calm eyes, no makeup exaggeration. Simple professional clothing, the kind of presence that didn't try to impress but still held attention. "Mr. Hale?" "Yes," Richard replied. She stood up and offered her hand. "I'm Claire Morgan, thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, not nervous, not overly excited, just professional. Richard noticed that immediately. Most people he met these days either pitied him or tried to flatter him. She did neither. "I wasn't sure I would," he said honestly. Claire nodded. "I understand. Your email response made that clear." A slight silence followed. Then she gestured toward the small meeting room. "Please, let's talk." Inside the room, there was no luxury table, no assistants. No glass-walled executive design, just 2 chairs, a whiteboard, and a stack of printed business reports. Claire placed a file in front of him. "This is what's left of your company's market footprint after collapse." Richard didn't open it. "I already know what it looks like," he said quietly. Claire didn't react emotionally. She simply continued, "You don't know me, so I'll be direct." That caught his attention. Most people danced around him. She didn't. "I'm not here to offer sympathy. I'm here to offer a rebuild plan. Richard leaned back slightly. A rebuild? Yes, she said. You think Northbridge can be rebuilt? Claire nodded. Not by the old structure. But yes, parts of it can be saved. Richard almost smiled, but it wasn't humor, it was disbelief. You're young, he said. And you're talking about rebuilding a company that destroyed experienced investors. Claire didn't flinch. I've seen experienced investors destroy companies too. That sentence hung in the air. Simple, but sharp. Richard looked at her properly now, not just as a consultant. What's your background, he asked? Corporate restructuring? Risk analysis? Small business turnarounds? You've never led a company like mine. No, she admitted. But I've fixed pieces of companies like yours. Richard tapped the table lightly. And why me? Claire hesitated for the first time. Then she said, because you didn't leave when it collapsed. You're still here. That means you're not finished. That line landed differently. It wasn't praise, it was observation. For a moment, Richard said nothing. Outside the window, rain traced slow lines down the glass. He had heard hundreds of pitches in his career. But this was different. There was no desperation in her voice, only conviction. Finally, he asked, what exactly are you proposing? Claire opened the file. A lean restart, not a corporation. Not investors, a focused consulting unit, small team, low risk, we rebuild reputation first. Richard shook his head slightly. You're describing a downgrade, Claire responded instantly. I'm describing survival before growth. That made him pause. Survival before growth, not ego, not status, just reality. Richard stood up and walked toward the window. I spent 30 years building something massive, he said, and it buried me. Claire replied softly, then don't build massive again. Build correct. He turned slightly. You speak like you failed before. Claire looked down for a second. I have, she admitted. Richard noticed something in her tone. Not weakness, experience. A quiet moment passed. Then Richard asked, if I say yes, what do I become? Not a CEO. He looked at her. Then what? She replied. A contributor. Like the rest of us. That word hit harder than expected. Contributor. Not leader, not icon. Just someone useful again. Richard sat back down slowly. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a ghost of his past. He felt like a man standing at a door he hadn't opened yet. He looked at the file again. This time, he opened it. Claire watched quietly as he read. No pressure, no excitement, just patience. After a long silence, Richard said, this will take years. Claire nodded. Yes, and no guarantee of success. Yes. Richard closed the file. Then said something unexpected. I don't trust easily anymore, Claire replied. Neither do I. That was the first moment of alignment. Not agreement. Understanding. Richard stood up again. He looked at the small office, the plain walls, the modest setup. Then back at her. One condition, he said. Claire waited. If I join this, I don't want motivation. I don't want speeches. I want truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Claire nodded once. You'll get nothing else. A pause. Then Richard extended his hand. All right. Let's see if this works. Claire shook his hand firmly. No celebration, no smiles. Just a beginning. As Richard left the office that day, something inside him shifted slightly. Not hope, not excitement. Something quieter, purpose restarting. And behind him, Claire stood by the window watching him walk into the rain. She didn't know it yet. But this wasn't just a business decision. It was the start of rebuilding two broken lives. In completely different ways. The next morning arrived colder than usual. Seattle's sky looked like it hadn't decided whether to rain again or just stay gray forever. Richard Hale stood outside a small co-working space in the city center. This was the new office. No glass towers, no corporate branding. Just shared desks, cheap coffee, and the sound of people trying to build something from nothing inside. Claire Morgan was already there. Focused, laptop open, a stack of printed documents beside her. She looked up as Richard entered. You're early, she said. I didn't have anywhere else to be, he replied honestly. That answer carried more weight than either of them acknowledged. Claire slid a document toward him. This is everything we've recovered from Northbridge's remaining assets. Richard sat down slowly. He didn't look enthusiastic. He already knew it wouldn't be good. Claire continued. Most of the client contracts are gone. 2 subsidiaries were sold. 1 is under legal dispute. Richard exhaled quietly. So basically, nothing left. Claire didn't sugarcoat it. Correct. A long silence followed. For the first time since this rebuild started, Richard felt the full weight of reality again. Not emotional collapse. Just truth. Claire opened another file. This was Northbridge Global Holdings at its peak. Graphs appeared on the screen, revenue charts, expansion maps, global offices. At its height, it was powerful enough to influence entire markets. Richard stared at it without blinking. I remember when this felt unstoppable, he said quietly. Claire replied, most companies feel unstoppable right before they break. That line stayed in the room longer than the conversation. Claire turned the laptop toward him. I've drafted a rebuild structure. Richard leaned forward slightly. On the screen, small consulting division 4-person core team focus, risk recovery plus corporate restructuring, no external investors for now. Richard frowned slightly. This is extremely small. Claire nodded, yes, because large systems failed you. Richard studied her for a moment. You're deliberately avoiding scale. I'm prioritizing control. That was something he understood immediately. Control was what he had lost. Richard leaned back. This won't attract serious clients. Claire responded calmly. Not immediately. And how long until immediately becomes never? Claire didn't hesitate. As long as it takes to prove we're stable again. Richard shook his head slightly. You're patient. I'm realistic. He looked at her directly. In my world, patience gets you replaced. Claire replied without emotion, and in mine, impatience gets you bankrupt. That stopped him. Two completely different philosophies, both true. Claire stood up and walked to the whiteboard. We need one project, something small but visible. Richard asked. From where? Claire wrote 3 words. Local businesses recovery, she turned back. There are dozens of small companies here that survived the economic downturn but don't know how to scale. We help one. Publicly, transparently. Richard crossed his arms. And why would they trust us? Claire looked at him. Because you used to be Richard Hale. That sentence carried weight. Even in failure, reputation still existed. That afternoon, Richard stepped out alone. He walked through Seattle streets, cafes, bookstores, small startups in glass rooms. Life continued without him, no headlines mentioning his fall anymore. He wasn't relevant news now, just history. He stopped at a coffee shop window. Inside, young entrepreneurs were pitching ideas on laptops. Excitement, energy, risk. Things he used to understand instinctively. Now they felt distant. When he returned, Claire was speaking to someone on the phone. She looked up and muted the call. We might have a lead, she said. Richard raised an eyebrow. Already? A local logistics company, small, struggling, needs restructuring advice. Richard sat down. Are they aware who we are? Claire nodded. They know we're new. That's why they're willing. Richard leaned back. Or that's why they're desperate. Claire didn't deny it. Sometimes that's the same thing. Claire ended the call and looked at him. They want a meeting tomorrow. Richard stayed silent for a moment. This was it, the first real step. Not theory, not planning, execution. Finally, he said, book it. Claire nodded once. Good, Richard added. But if we fail this, we lose everything again, Claire replied simply. Then we adjust again. He looked at her. That's your answer for everything, isn't it? Claire picked up her pen. Yes. That night, Richard sat alone in his small apartment again. The silence wasn't as heavy as before, but it was still there. He looked at an old framed photo of Northbridge's peak days, then at his phone. No messages, no board calls, no emergencies, just emptiness. But underneath it, something different. Movement. Meanwhile, Claire stayed late at the co-working space. Lights dim, laptop glowing. She wasn't celebrating progress, she was building structure. Step by step, no emotion, just focus. Outside, rain started again. She paused for a moment, then continued working. Because rebuilding was not dramatic, it was repetitive. The next day would be their first real test, not of business, but of trust. Richard closed his eyes briefly. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he lost. He was thinking about what might still be built. And somewhere in another quiet office, Claire Morgan was preparing a plan that could either restart everything or destroy the last hope they had.